Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Amanda,
I'm Laura.
I'm Kendra.
and today we're going to be diving into a topic that affects many of us, especially professionals who are used to structure in our careers. When it comes to making personal or life choices, even those of us who excel in high stakes decision making at work can sometimes feel paralyzed. We will in this podcast explore why indecision happens, the impact it has, and some practical ways to overcome it. And we will explain the psychological side of indecision and then share some real life experiences that we've experienced while facing this challenge. So thank you for joining us.
Yay. Okay. So, yes, indecision. That is in itself probably several podcasts, but let's just talk about why it's so common, even amongst professionals whom seems like most of us, especially gone into medicine, had that very clear cut decision made, maybe as far back as for me, it was like seventh, eighth grade. So it was like high school, I was focused, college, I was focused, all going down the path from school and all the steps that seemingly I didn't really have to make a choice about, maybe just like which school, where I was going to live, like which residency. But it was very clearly mapped out. So there wasn't a lot of things to decide. However, as you go through the steps, there are a few decisions, but for the most part, it's pretty clear and mapped out. So then once you're finished with everything and you're like, oh, shoot, what's next? Oh, no. Now what? Right? You're an attending. Now what? And I think, Amanda, you talked about this before we jumped on air, that some of our clients, they just get to that point where you kind of, maybe you're not board certified, you're board eligible, you've graduated, you've done all the steps and you're in attending and you're just like, oh, now what? So, and that can be sometimes an insidious, like, first experience of maybe some burnout, or maybe it contributes to the burnout feeling. It's that stuckness and just the inability to make a next step or make a decision. So things like, when you become an attending or picking a job, is this a good job? Is this really what I want to do? Do I want to be in the busy academic center or community hospital? Do I want, to take call Q2 or Q6, 7, Will my call be a 24-hour call that I maybe get a few calls a night, or will I be up all night actually at the hospital with, one case after the next? I don't know. But sometimes once we get into it, we can really spiral into a vortex, and just a lot of thoughts convince us of a lot of truths. And really, there's only one truth, and that is you just have to take the next right best step. One decision, the next best right step for you. So sometimes indecision has etiologies based in things like fear of failure. I mean, perfectionists, we do not like to fail. Sometimes we don't even want to try because there's a consideration of failure, right? So we don't even get out there. We don't even try. Maybe it's something new. We talk about how imposter syndrome a couple of podcasts ago. We talked about how that kind of has an insidious onset. And that can be just starting a new job, going from residency to attendinghood, and you're like unsure as to if you can even handle this. And then you just have a low self-confidence because it's just new. It's a new environment. You're making all these decisions, based on like patient care, medical decision making. And then to even decide something about your own life can really kind of bring fear comes out. Really, it's just overt fear. And then where do we get our information? Well, we talk to our mentors, we talk to our peers, our significant others. And so are we getting enough information? Do we have the right information? Is this a credible source? Like, two people could work in a hospital and have very different perspectives on how that hospital runs, right? And so now do we have the right information? Are we getting what we need to make a decision? And no wonder some of us kind of have, what do we say, that analysis paralysis, right? So we just cannot make a decision. And so out of that fear and out of just not even being able to make a decision, we can just stay stuck. So in a TEDx talk, Nawala Walsh has a few suggestions. And so we're going to kind of go into that. And there are three kinds of distortions that indecision arise from. She talks about proportion distortion. And so that's when the decision feels overwhelming or too big. So I know one of the things I think that I battled with, I think y'all have heard us all talk about, we're two physician households. So I have a significant other, a husband that is also a physician. And so when we were considering where we were living, it seemed like we had been kind of vagabonds or gypsies for the last whatever 6 years, because we were going from med school to residency to fellowship, all the things, and you just weren't ever settled. And for some reason, my mind, it was like a huge decision, like, where are we going to land? Because it's forever, right? And nobody says that. Like, that was that was my thought. That was just going to be forever. Roots were getting planted, and then we could never move again. And so, just really that whole, am I going to make the right decision to live where I'm going to be forever? And who really says that? It isn't forever. Things change, right? But because I felt like, oh, this is our first job out of training, or our first place to really be planted, it seemed like, oh, this is the only place, this is the only option, or we have to make it together because it's like forever, right? And so that's not really the case. Then she talks about a temporal distortion. So this is like more of a time. So it seems like it's too far in the future. So, making a decision. I know I just sent my oldest off to college, and it seemed like just yesterday we were talking about college, and it was like, oh, but you're a freshman in high school. Do we need to talk about that? And it's funny because we were just talking on the phone about what she's going to do when she graduates college. I'm like, we just moved you there, right? So it seems too far. And like, do we really need to make a decision about that now? Yes, we can gather evidence and information now, but you don't need to go to the job fair and land a job, like, right? But it does seem kind of overwhelming if it's too far in the future. And so the other thing about that is just you can think about that it's so far in the future, like 4 or 5 years from now, and then not gain information. That's a flip side. And just be like, no sense of urgency, and just wait and just continue to ruminate on it. So that's another part of the distortion that affects indecision. And then there's the old emotional distortion. So feeling feelings, right? When it feels too hard because it's linked to fear, or it's linked to some sort of quote unquote negative emotion. We don't really like to classify our emotions positive, negative, because then we don't want to feel those negative emotions, but it's good to feel all the feelings, right? We talk about that. But disappointment and regret are two that are considerably uncomfortable, and may kind of factor into when you're deciding something, because not a lot of us like to feel disappointment, either to ourselves, disappoint ourselves, or others. And we definitely don't love regret. And that can come back really to haunt you, because then if you felt like you made the wrong decision, or it didn't turn out how you want, then that regret just gets watered and fed, and it just grows like wildfire. So I shared a couple of examples in my life. What do you guys think? You have any of these when it comes to making decisions?
Well, I know for me, when I was experiencing severe burnout early in my career, and we didn't have resources like we have now to help with it. I knew that what was going on was not sustainable for me, and I was so miserable. It took a long time for me to decide to make a change. And I think, like, especially in medicine, we identify so much with being a doctor that we can feel trapped. It's like once we get into it, then that's what we're doing for the next 30 years, or somehow we become less of who we are. And
Right.
that's just, I don't know. I wish I could talk to my younger self about so many things pertaining to that, but that's one of the things that really was tough for me to make a decision about. And finally I did, and it was good, but there was a lot of suffering in between.
Yeah, for sure. The whole thing, like when I ended up doing the integrative medicine fellowship, that was after it got so painful that I had to make a decision, because I thought I was going to continue to get plagues. But the whole proportion distortion, I had that bad. Like, I put all of this time into becoming a doctor in emergency medicine, and my brain was telling me like I'd have to start over from scratch. You don't have to start back over with kindergarten. You might have to trade another couple years in something, or go to trade school, or go to something else. But it's like I was acting like everything I had done up until now would have been trashed and I would start over. That's not accurate. I wouldn't have to go back to college. I wouldn't have to go back to, especially if I'm not doing something in medicine, I wouldn't have to go back into medical school. So I don't know. Brains just make things sound, I mean, they are really focused on the status quo and you staying safe. So risk they are risk averse for
Oh my
many people
goodness.
at least.
That is the understatement of the year. Like
Yeah.
something different. We're going to die.
Yes, exactly. So it is helpful to just kind of like, oh, yeah, I've got a proportion distortion, or I'm making this sound like I don't need to make a decision. And so that means I'm just going to stay in this miserable spot, I guess, forever. I don't know, because I'm going to stay scared to try something new. Brains are wild.
And then when you
And
just
just,
make one decision, like one small decision, like you're like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
not so
Yeah,
bad.
when the plagues happen, like I had this
It's
whole thing of like if I ever tried to do something else, I'd have to leave my family because there wasn't something to train in Springfield, Missouri, and then my family would fall apart, and like it just would catastrophize and escalate into like my life is ruined somehow. I mean, wow.
yeah.
Then I had a weekend where it's like, no, I have to do something, and then I was like, oh yeah, I guess I could take this class online. That's interesting. Not dramatic at all.
our
Yeah.
favorite meme
No.
that says,
Totally
wow, that
doable.
escalated quickly.
Yes. That
No
one.
one. It's actually not a big deal.
No.
Weird.
Yeah. And in life, we think if we make a decision and we feel scared about it, that something has gone wrong or we're doing something that we shouldn't be. And unless you have stepped into an abandoned house at like 10 o'clock at night, it doesn't mean that something went wrong. Like going into the abandoned house at 10 o'clock at night might be a bad decision. But when we feel scared, a lot of times it just means that growth is about to happen. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So now that we've identified the problem, let's talk some solutions. Reframing, we do a lot of reframing with our clients. Reframing is so powerful. Here are some techniques that you can consider using if you're struggling with indecision about something. So if it's a big decision, you can break it down into smaller parts. If, for instance, if you want to make a career change and the career change requires a fellowship. I have a client right now I'm thinking of that she wants to make a career change and it would require a fellowship. Well, the first step is to gather some information and to talk to people. And we can get frozen in the state of, I'm afraid that I'm going to fail at this new thing. And I don't know how I'm going to make it work. And it's so funny how our brains often get so spun up and I don't know how I can make it work that we don't even get the basic information about what the facts are about the situation. So it might be there are some fellowships that you can go to part-time and double the time that you're there and still keep working your current job and do, a little bit in the fellowship and get additional training that you want to make a transition. So getting that big decision can be broken down into just little steps. So just start focusing on that next reasonable step and limiting outside opinions. I want to say, like, it's a lot of times a good idea to limit outside opinions. It's so important for us to get grounded in who we are and what we think about ourselves, especially as we're trying to make a change that we think will make life better for us and the ones we love. If we want opinions, it's best to just like keep that in your close circle. And then if you get feedback or information that doesn't align with your values or what you think will work for you, then just discard that. But if you get information that's helpful, then you can use that to inform your decision. Okay, so the second one is challenge the temporal distortion. So for decisions that feel like too far away, remind yourself that delaying action could mean missing out on months or years of happiness. So one example would be if you haven't started investing in your 401k, or if you haven't started some kind of retirement plan, it might feel far away if you're 30. However, that time will creep up. And so it might be a good time to just start thinking about it. If we know that we're going to stay in our current job for another 6 months or another year, it's not a great idea to think all the time how much you hate it and how you cannot wait to leave it and think about trying to find a new job. Or if you're not sure if you want to leave it, it's not helpful to think about it all the time. It just burns up so much mental energy like thinking about how this job is awful and how I need to find a new one, but I'm not ready to find a new one. A great thing to do, or a helpful technique to use, would be to just set a deadline for yourself, or set a date in the future that you're going to start thinking about that again. So if you know that you're going to be in this job for another year, at least, you're not sure if you want to leave it or stay, it doesn't hurt to say, okay, I'm not even going to worry about this for another 3 months. Put it on your calendar. 3 months, I'm going to start evaluating. Do I want to stay or do I want to leave? And it will free up so much mental bandwidth to not be thinking about that all the time. It'll help you feel better too. The third one is to reduce emotional distortion. So if a decision feels too hard, remember that emotions that come with decisions, like shame and disappointment, they are temporary, and they're things that we can work through. And as we mentioned earlier, a lot of times when we're feeling discomfort, it doesn't mean something wrong is happening. It may mean that growth is happening and something important needs to happen. In fact, most of the best things in life happen on the other side of some discomfort like that. So if something feels terrible and you can't imagine doing it, but you think you need to do it, think about some options between the extremes. So for example, if you're in a relationship and things are not going great, it doesn't have to be stay together or break up. There can be other options like going to therapy or a trial separation. There was one couple that I heard about who had a separation, and for a few months only communicated by text. So they make sure that they were being as kind and true and thoughtful in their communication with each other as possible, and could avoid responding when they were triggered. There's so many different options for probably any decision that we may be struggling with. It doesn't have to be either or. There can be something in the middle that could be considered. So, and many paths can often lead to a good outcome. That's important to remember too. A cognitive distortion that we might have is that there's only one right way that we can be doing things for us to have a good outcome. And that's just not the case. We're here to learn and grow, and we can do that many, many different ways.
I was just going to add a little bit to the temporal distortion is like, just pick one, but you may need to gather information to be able to make this isn't a just be reckless and pick one, but some of us will self-indulge with the information gathering period of time. It might be decades, right? So what would a reasonable person need if they were really committed to deciding how much time do you really need to get the information you need to make a decision, and then hold yourself to that so that you don't just prolong that information gathering period forever. You just need to make a good enough choice and then set that deadline when you're going to revisit it. And then brains like to freak out like I'm stuck with it. Listen, if a non-negotiable, a deal breaker happens, then you have new information and you can reassess at that time. Like brains just like to think like once you make a decision, you're stuck to that forever, and it make it so
regret it.
Oh yeah, and you're going to wind up a non-insignificant amount of our clients like have this fantasy of winding up in a ditch and eating cat food. I don't know, more than one person.
It's true.
So dramatic.
Yeah.
Like, or you would just go back to the previous job, or you would just, whatever. Who knows? You know what you would do? You'd figure it out. That's what you would do.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would say too, sometimes it's ironic because we make decisions at work every day. Like that's what we do. We're problem solvers, right? And so you have to like acknowledge that actually you do know how to make decisions, because I think we can talk ourselves even out of the fact that we can even make a decision. Like we convince ourselves, oh, I can't. And you go to work and you make how many decisions? How many decisions in the ER do I make in 5 minutes? Well, if it's crazy, I'm getting interrupted every 30 seconds. I've got 4 charts open in front of me, and I've got like someone screaming, like, someone pick up the line and take this transfer, right? And so I just made 16 decisions in 90 seconds. So sometimes we just have to remind ourselves, actually, we do know how to make a decision. We do it all the time. That is even like comforting in itself, right?
Yeah. Well, and honestly, this is where working with a coach is really helpful because when I'm talking to a coach about something like this, they just cut through all the crap and are like, okay, no, like, when are you getting this done? And let's put it on the calendar and let's stop, the indulgent information gathering or whatever it is. Just like, what do you want? What do you want? Do you want to keep being stuck and stagnant in the same place, or are you ready to move forward? And if you're ready to move forward, let's move forward.
Perfect. So at the end of her TEDx talk, Nuala Walsh talks about 3 questions she asks herself when she finds herself getting stuck in that rumination phase. And surely I'm not the only one that has ever been in this scenario. Should I stay? Should I go? Is it worth it? What if this happens? What if that happens? Well, I don't know, but then will I regret it? So she asks herself these 3 questions. Number 1, what's the worst that could happen if I made this choice? It is interesting that by asking ourselves that, like, a lot of times we're afraid to even consider that. And so it's this nebulous fear of something might happen. So what's the worst that could happen if I make this choice? Number 2, what's the likelihood of that worst case scenario happening? A lot of times it's minuscule. And number 3, okay, let's just go with it. And if it did happen, how would I handle it? So just acknowledging the worst case scenario can sometimes help you realize that it's manageable. So my example is there was some stuff that went down in my marriage that I had never expected. I felt very strongly before it happened to me that I would know exactly what I was going to do. But turned out when it happened, I was confused. Not all of the information was lining up with what I thought my decision was going to be. Plus, I had some small kids. And so to stay or to go, I was spinning out on to stay in my marriage or leave my marriage forever. I had this classic thing, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, not fully ready to commit to staying, but yet not leaving either. And I had to ask myself, this sort of questioning did help me tremendously. What's the worst that could happen if I choose? What I ended up doing was choose to stay. What's the worst that could happen? Well, the same BS would happen again. Okay. What's the likelihood? I don't know. That I Googled, and it was like every professional was like, well, it all depends. So I don't know. There's a non-zero chance. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. My brain was so in fight or flight and like my limbic system, like it needed certainty in a scenario where there would never be certainty. And that was, I don't like that, turns out.
Yeah, no, none of us do.
But number 3, if it did happen, how would I handle it? Well, if it happened again, I would feel pretty comfortable leaving. Like, it would be okay, and no one died. But you know what would be a slow, painful death is not either committing or leaving. That is what the slow, painful death would be. So just like facing these fears head on and like, all right, well, a lot of our clients are like, should I stay? Should I go? Well, what if I stay and then I end up, I'm like, what's the worst that could happen? Like, I don't know, get fired? Oh, yeah. Well, you're already thinking about leaving anyway. It's like, oh, yeah. I guess it's not. Oh, yeah. Huh. Okay. Well, here we go.
And some of us are like walking into work like, am I getting fired today? And just wishing for the decision to be made for us.
I know.
Is today the day?
I know.
So in all humor, we laugh about these things because sometimes the uncomfortable is better dealt with in humor instead of tears. So let's recap some of our main points. So we talked about indecision and we talked about where it comes from. Fear of failure, lack of confidence, of course, our loving personality trait as physicians, perfectionism. So we see where it's coming from. We recognize there's some things our brain offers up. There are the distortions we talked about, these lovely facades that our brain wants to help us make these decisions through. And whether it's too big of a decision, whether the decision's far away, whether it seems too hard, Basically, it can just give us that awareness of our indecisiveness and just say, listen, like, actually, if I take a step back, the facts are that I can make a decision and I just need to cut the crap, like we said, leave the drama on the table and just get to the facts, right? Even if you have to write them down, meet with a coach. That's what we're here for. Like, sometimes you do just got to have someone there to like pull out the facts and have that awareness or that focus on the facts. Like, this is how we're going to make this decision. We make decisions in the ED all the time because we have facts like risk stratifying, and we know what will happen if we don't resuscitate a septic person, right? We know the consequences of that. And so we choose to, follow guidelines and protocols. Like, we can do the same thing here. And then we break down the decisions. We set deadlines. We reframe the expectations. We can overcome this feeling of stuckness by just reframing. And whether if it's too big, we break it down. If it's too hard, we set a realistic expectation. We remind ourselves we can do this, and then we go from there. And like we said, we really just need to do the next best step. So what's the next best step? How do we go from not stepping to the next best step, to moving forward? Because we just want progress here, people, right? Just progress in any direction is progress, right? And then we talked about the 3 questions that Amanda said, and we'll include these all in the show notes and the link to the TEDx talk. But those 3 questions to ask yourself: what's the worst that could happen? What's the likelihood of the worst happens? And if it did, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to handle it? Right? So those great conversation today about making decisions. And if it did help you, please don't forget, leave us a review. We're asking just for 5 stars. That's it. And a few words so that other physicians can find us. And after all, it makes our ripple a little bit bigger. And we want to tell you about a new free video that we put out. It's called How to Crush Physician Burnout for Good Without Cutting Back Hours, Quitting Medicine, or Sucking It Up in Silence. So scroll down in the show notes, click the link, and check it out today. So until next time, you are whole, you are a gift to medicine, and the work you do matters.